Robert, thank you very much indeed for coming along today and giving us a talk about E.F. Schumacher and his conservative radicalism. Robert, I shall hand over to you and ask you to introduce yourself as you'd like to be known as a historian of economics, I think is probably what you've described to me is the best way of saying it. But then, Robert, thank you very much indeed. And over to you. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ian. I just want to be sure that everybody can hear me properly. I'm properly audible and everything is clear. Okay. Uh, yes, it's a pleasure to speak to a group of Schumacherians. I'm a historian of economics. I'm from Dublin. I've been based in Montreal for a long time. Um, as I was saying to Ian before we came online, I began my work in the history of game theory, which is very, very different from what I'm doing now. And about 10 years ago, I turned to Fritz Schumacher. I had read Schumacher as a student in Dublin as a sort of respite from micro, macro, and econometrics. And I was living in the country outside Montreal. And I was actually living in the country and observing North American farming that brought me back to Schumacher. And then I discovered that his papers were down at the center in Massachusetts, and I came in contact with Barbara Wood. I see Diana Schumacher's here in the audience, so I say hello to Diana Schumacher, who we haven't met yet. But I came in contact with Barbara, who was a great help to me, as was the center in Massachusetts, and I plunged into the papers. And I've been working on this steadily, slowly, for the last few years, writing papers based on my work and trying to piece together what probably will eventually become a new intellectual biography of Schumacher, but very much building on Barbara Wood's early book, which is a very, very solid book and to which I return very frequently. Today, I want to simply give you an overview of my work to sort of walk you through Schumacher's life as I see it after all this time in the archives, and then we can talk, we can discuss. I hope I'll make it clear what I mean by the conservative radicalism of Schumacher, in the sense that in some respects his thought was quite radical, and certainly for an economist, his thought was quite radical. But it wasn't radical in the sense of Marxist communist radicalism. And there was a sort of a strong conservative element to it. So I'll try to bring some of that out. But I think conservative radicalism is a term that we can properly apply to him. So I'm just going to go through a series of slides, sort of covering the life. I'll try and do it fairly promptly, expeditiously, and have time for some discussion and questions. So Schumacher was German, the son of Hermann Schumacher, who was a professor of political economy in Berlin. But very quickly he became involved with academic life in England. In 29, as a young student, he visited the LSE in Cambridge. And in 29 at Cambridge, he came in contact with Keynes. And this contact with Keynes was important. It would become very important later in his life. Then the year afterwards, 1930, he came back on a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford. He was one of the first Rhodes Scholars, German Rhodes Scholars, to be accepted at Oxford since World War I, sort of as relations are being repaired. He came back to Oxford, where he met a figure who'd be very important in his life later, namely David Astor. He also knew Adam von Trott, of whom some of you will have heard. Astor and Trott were very good friends. Trott, of course, was German, and Trott would later be executed by Hitler in the failed assassination attempt. But Astor was a very important person for Schumacher later, and they met at Oxford, 1930, 1931. After 2 years at Oxford, he went to Columbia, still on his Rhodes Scholarship, where he worked as a research assistant for a while to Professor Parker Willis, who was a Wall Street monetary critic. And then the year afterwards, he lectured as a young lecturer at Columbia. 34, he went back to Germany. And this seems to have been a difficult time. He never warmed to the new regime, you can put it that way. And there appears to have been, according to Barbara Wood, depression and illness, so that he never actually finished his Oxford degree. He began working on a doctorate at that time, but he didn't persist with that. And he became involved in what translates as a syndicate for the creation of additional exports. So this was essentially a small financial company who provided advice to companies on how to deal with the very complicated system of currency payments, exporting and importing, that had been put in place by the Germans under Schacht. Schumacher worked in this with a small number, including brothers-in-law and banker, lawyer friends. They were very successful, it appears, but nonetheless, Schumacher remained unhappy in Germany, and he sought to leave. And he did this in late 36, early 37. He and his wife moved to London. And this was a source of tension. Barbara writes about this. This was a source of tension in the family for familial reasons, and also for nationalistic reasons, if you like, this being a time of great tension between the countries. So he moved to London to take up a job with Unilever Corporation, which was a client of the syndicate. Now, I should add that at this time, through the course of this work, Schumacher acquired a very great and detailed knowledge of the German payment system. He became truly expert in this area. That's important. Moved to London, worked with Unilever. That lasted, I think, almost 2 years. And he then left, and he began a new venture, which was devoted to the creation of manufacture of electric vehicles. And then there was the outbreak of World War II, September 1939. Now, upon arrival in England, he had made contact with an important figure, Robert Brand. Robert Brand was a banker. He was at Lazard Brothers in the city. And Robert Brand had been involved in the British civil service, in colonial matters in South Africa, came back to London as a banker, was involved in German affairs all the way through the 1930s, late 20s, 1930s, in administering loans, in helping the Germans deal with their currency and financial problems. Brand was also I wouldn't say, at that point he wasn't a good friend of Keynes, but he was certainly an acquaintance of Keynes and knew Keynes well, going back to the Treaty of Versailles, the Paris Conference. So Schumacher, as of 1937, was writing papers on Germany for Robert Brand. And when it came to the outbreak of war, and Schumacher and his wife became enemy aliens, and he was no longer working at this point, he was helped by Robert Brand. And as I said, Brand was David Astor's uncle. So Brand was close to Cliveden, close to the Astors, and part of that group. Later, they would be criticized, as you know, as as being appeasers towards Hitler, but that's very much a controversial subject. Certainly, Brand was not an appeaser, nor was the young David Astor. So when it came to the outbreak of war and Schumacher and his wife became enemy aliens, they remained in London for a while, and then in early 40, they moved out to Robert Brand's country home, which was Eden Hall in Eden, Northamptonshire. And they remained there as I say, from May 1940 to March 1942. Schumacher was there living in the gate lodge to the estate, and he was there to work as a farm laborer and to pay rent on the cottage in which they lived. And he did this for this period here. This was a very difficult time. There was a lot of hostility in Eden towards the Germans, German visitors. This was a difficult time, and they were also living in fairly primitive circumstances. I don't have a picture of the gate lodge here, but it was a very small house. No running water, as far as I know, probably no electricity. They were sharing it with two Polish women, refugees. This was a difficult time. And as I said, Schumacher was there to work on the farm. In the middle of this, there was a clampdown on German enemy aliens, and he was swept up and taken off to Priest internment camp, where he spent from July to September 1940. We don't have any photographs of Priest Heath. These are drawings from a former inmate, if you want to call it that, at the camp. People, they lived in tents, washed outdoors. Situation was not easy. Schumacher fell quite ill, and he appears to have been released early with the help of Brand and Lady Astor. So he was released, came back to the farm, and continued his work on the farm. As I said, during this time, he was writing papers on Germany for Robert Brand, and also for Lord Astor. In the course of this, he wrote an important paper proposing an international plan for currency payments, which would be put in place after the war. And this brought him in contact with Keynes. Through Brand sent this paper on to Keynes. Keynes was very interested in this. And there began a relationship that I've explored in detail in a paper that's in the pipeline, in which we can see that Schumacher's paper on currency arrangements did have an influence on Keynes's plan, which was later presented to Bretton Woods. So Schumacher was involved in this. Thanks to Keynes, he was rescued from the farm and got a post in research at Oxford. And so he moved to Oxford in 1942. I should also add that while he was in the camp, he underwent a sort of a socialist conversion. He underwent his politics changed. His politics were more, if you like, radicalized in the camp. A significant influence here were obviously his fellow inmates, several of whom were from the German left. A key one here for Schumacher was Kurt Naumann, who at that point was a militant communist from Germany. So Schumacher, while at Priest Heath internment camp, underwent a socialist conversion and became much more radical in his views. So he went to Oxford, where he joined a group of socialists at the Institute of Statistics, which at that point was being run by Michał Kalecki, the Polish socialist economist. So he spent the war as a Fabian socialist at Oxford. the Keynes plan saga. I won't go into this in great detail, but as I said, he wrote a paper on currency plans. Keynes took account of this, but refused to publish Schumacher's own paper. The reasons for this were not, it wasn't deviousness on the part of Keynes. I think it was because the work was under conditions of secrecy at the Treasury. So Keynes was writing his plan at the Treasury in conditions of secrecy, but could not reveal the development of this to Schumacher. So from Schumacher's point of view, he was being shut out, and he developed a certain resentment towards Keynes. And he would later, at the very, in the 1970s, he still felt that his work had been, if you like, stolen by Keynes and presented later at Bretton Woods. He felt as though he had been spurned. He, he was, as I said, working away at the Institute of Statistics, doing a huge amount of work, huge amount of papers. He was one of the ghost writers of the Beveridge Report in 1944, along with Joan Robinson and Nicholas Caldor, two Cambridge economists. He was closely involved with the German Social Democrats in exile. At this point, Kurt Naumann and other Germans from the camp were involved in this. He was very involved in them, with them in London during the war. So that was the time that he spent at Oxford during the war. In 1945, with the end of the war, he returned to Germany. This was the first time back in Germany since, as I said, 36, 37. He returned to ruined Germany. This was a traumatic experience for him. He writes about this in his letters, about the shock of returning to Berlin and other German cities immediately after the war. He was part of the strategic bombing survey alongside Galbraith, John Kenneth Galbraith, and Nicholas Caldor from Cambridge. He was part of the strategic bombing survey, which involved interviews with people, including his father. I should also add that during the war, Schumacher lost his younger brother, Ernst, who was fighting with the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front in the Soviet Union. So there were these great tensions in Schumacher's life concerning national loyalty, political belief, an outsider in England as a German, and then something of an outsider in Germany when he returned after the war. This is well, the difficulties persisted even after the war ended. Returning to Germany, he was able to make contact with the Heisenbergs. This is Werner Heisenberg you see here in the top right-hand side. This is Elizabeth Schumacher, who married Werner Heisenberg. Elizabeth Schumacher, Schumacher's sister, who married Werner Heisenberg in 1937. Precisely when Schumacher was returning to Germany in 1945, Heisenberg was being kidnapped and taken in the opposite direction to England, where he and the other German physicists were held at, I think it was Farm Hall, the country home, the stately home, where they were held for 6 months and bugged, their conversations bugged. There's an entire story there about the German physicists. But Schumacher re-established contact with the Heisenbergs. He was very important to the Heisenbergs in the period just after the war. He provided them with food when they didn't have enough food for their children in 1945 and 46. And as you probably know, there's a controversy surrounding Heisenberg concerning his political loyalties during the war. The suspicion being that he was somehow loyal to the German regime because he remained in Germany. But Schumacher never believed that Heisenberg was somehow loyal to the Third Reich. He never believed that. Although it's fair to say that given the later evolution of Schumacher's beliefs and his philosophy, there were tensions with Heisenberg as a nuclear physicist. And I think we see that in some of the correspondence. After the strategic bombing survey, he obtained British citizenship. He became a British subject. Went back to Germany, where he spent the next 4 years working with the Allied Control Commission. He was now a British subject in Germany, involved in post-war reconstruction, denazification, and he did this for the best part of 4 years. By the end of those 4 years, he was glad to get out of Germany and return to England. This he did when he returned to the National Coal Board, where he was the economist. That was in 1950. And so he returned to the Coal Board as their economist. And this marks the beginning. This is when things really become interesting, because this marks the beginning of what would eventually become a sort of a double life for Schumacher. A double life in the sense that professionally he was working as an economist with the National Coal Board, which is one of the largest companies in the world. Privately, he embarked on a spiritual quest, which led him away from mainstream economics, led him away from modern economic development. And this is what happened over the course of the 1950s and the 1960s. So a key feature of Schumacher's life in the 50s and the 60s was the emergence of this tension between what he was doing professionally and what he was undergoing privately. And the double life is not my term, it's his. He used the term double life to describe what he was undergoing, specifically in 59. When he joined the Coal Board, he was at a bit of a loose end in the 1950s. They seemed not to know what to do with him. He had an office in Hobart House in London, but he was not fully utilized by the Coal Board at all, at all. He had time on his hands. It was not a high pressure position at that point. He had time in his hands. He was at a loose end, and he felt neglected by the Coal Board. And it goes without saying that Schumacher was a highly intelligent person, so he needed to be active in something. And he began reading. He began reading in a range of areas, which I loosely group into Buddhism and yoga, Gurdjieff-Uspensky, and the Soil Association. It's not just reading, but becoming involved. Briefly, in terms of Buddhism and yoga, he became involved in the London Buddhist Society. He read very, very widely in Buddhism. This photograph you have in the middle, Christmas Humphreys, who ran the London Buddhist Society. What's his name? Suzuki, the Japanese Zen Buddhist on the left, who wrote several popular books on Zen Buddhism. And on the right, Edward Konza, who was a German expatriate. Konza was very important for Schumacher. Like Konza had been a German communist who, I believe his books may actually have been burnt in Germany during the 30s, but he left Germany, went to Spain during the Civil War, lost his communism during the Civil War in Spain, and became a Buddhist, and became a translator of Buddhist texts. Konza was a gifted linguist. He spoke about 13 languages, and one of his first books was this book, Buddhism, its Essence and Development, 1951. That 1843 there is not a date. His book was 1951. Konza was important for Schumacher, and later during the 50s, Schumacher would take classes from Konza. Through his involvement in Buddhism, he would attend meetings at the Buddhist Society. He went to meditation classes. He became involved in yoga with his wife, with Yasudian, who was an Indian teacher in Switzerland. He became familiar with expatriate German Buddhists, in particular the German forest monks in Ceylon, later Sri Lanka. They were a very interesting group. They were Germans who had left Germany, some of them much in the 30s, very, very early. Some of them German Jews who embraced Buddhism and went off to Ceylon, established Buddhist camps or retreats, if you like, there. And by the key ones here are Yanatiloka and Nyanaponika, who I mentioned here. They're in the center of this image. And by the early 50s, they were returning to Germany to propagate and promote Buddhism in Germany, in a post-war stricken Germany. He became, through Konza and through his studies in Buddhism, he became familiar with these Buddhists. He had many of their books. He applied himself very studiously to Buddhism. This is his copy of the Dhammapada with his, very meticulous list of the verses that he had learned off by heart. So he became deeply involved in Buddhism in the early 50s. He also became involved in Gurdjieff and Uspensky, the Fourth Way. That's Gurdjieff on the left. Gurdjieff and his Russian disciple Uspensky held that people are asleep, they don't know what they're doing, and they can only come to know themselves by embarking on the Fourth Way. The Fourth Way involved hard physical labor, difficult dances known as the movements, which you see here, and a process of what they called self-remembering, which was essentially self-observation, mental discipline, under the tutelage of a teacher, be it Gurdjieff himself or Uspensky. Gurdjieff had established the Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man in a villa outside Paris in the 20s. Uspensky was based in London. Schumacher read Gurdjieff and read Uspensky deeply. An important book by Uspensky that he read was The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. A very key theme in these explorations, spiritual and esoteric explorations by Schumacher, a key theme obviously is this notion of self-improvement, salvation, life as a journey. And this conflicted, if you like, with the narrow conception of selfish, rational man that one finds in economics, namely Homo economicus. So Schumacher's involvement in these spiritual explorations sowed the seed of his eventual criticism of economics as a discipline, his criticism of Homo economicus. Among the Gurdjieffians, two of them in particular were important for Schumacher. One was Maurice Nicoll. Maurice Nicoll was a Harley Street surgeon who gave up his practice to go and join Gurdjieff in Paris, and he became a Gurdjieffian. He wrote many books, including The New Man, which was a Gurdjieffian interpretation of the Gospels. And Schumacher was very interested in nickel, read him in detail, and Schumacher, along with his mother, translated The New Man by Maurice Lickel into German in 1953. So Schumacher was deeply, deeply involved in this. Second person, the second Gurdjieffian who was important to Schumacher was John Bennett. John Bennett was involved in BCOR, British Coal Utilization Research. His background was in the sciences. So he had an involvement with the coal board through this research work he was doing in BCOR. Schumacher grew to know Bennett, became involved with him. Bennett lived at Coombe Springs, which was a very grand home in Richmond, where he ran Gurdjieffian gatherings involving harsh labor, the movements. He wrote books, including The Crisis of Human Affairs in 1951, which Schumacher read. These are photographs from Coombe Springs, where on the left you see I think it's called the Jama Chunatra, which is a kind of a temple, which John Bennett had built in the grounds of Coombe Springs. On the top right-hand side, you have Frank Lloyd Wright, the architect, visiting the Jama Chunatra at Coombe Springs with Bennett. Frank Lloyd Wright's wife was a Gurdjieffian. And when Gurdjieff would go to North America, he would tap the Lloyd Wrights for donations to the work. He raised a lot of money in the States, Gurdjieff. On the bottom right-hand side, the movements are organized by Bennett later at Sherborne House. Schumacher was very involved with Bennett, and he remained a friend of Bennett's until Bennett's death in the mid-1970s. The third area where the third sort of area of personal exploration and involvement by Schumacher was with the Soil Association. At his house in Caterham in Surrey, which was a large house on substantial site, substantial grounds, he became very involved in the garden. As soon as he moved there, when he and his wife were looking for houses in London in the late 1949, it was important to have some ground that could be cultivated. And so he became involved in gardening. This became very important to him, and he became involved in the Soil Association. The background for the Soil Association was complex. The key figures were Lord Northbourne in books like Look to the Land, Rolf Gardner in books like England Herself. Northbourne and Gardner were rural reconstructionists, very concerned with the depletion of rural and village life, concerned to rebuild it. Some of them were concerned to restore the place of the big house, if you like, in the country, the place of the gentry. Gardner would be one of those, also Northbourne. So there's this very interesting literature on rural reconstruction through the 1930s. And the Soil Association grew out of that. The key book for the creation of the Soil Association and the key person was Eve Balfour, who's here on the left on her tractor. She wrote The Living Soil, 44, if I remember correctly, drawing on Northbourne in particular. promoting what would later be called organic agriculture. At the time, it wasn't called that. But this book was a manifesto for what would later become the organic movement, leading to the formation of the Soil Association in 1946. The photo on the right, the person on the right, is Rolf Gardner, who was very involved in, as I said, rural reconstruction, the promotion of the rehabilitation of country life and old customs, Morris dancing, all of this. There's a very interesting literature. Gardner, I think with several of these people flirted with the fascist movement in England in the 1930s. Gardner flirted with it. He had strong connections with Germans. His mother was a German speaker from Vienna. So there was a certain amount of flirtation with right-wing ideas. Nonetheless, in the course of this history, Schumacher became a good friend of Gardner's through the Soil Association later. There's a very interesting history here. That was the Soil Association. Schumacher joined it quickly, and he would eventually become the president of the Soil Association in 1970. So he was a member all through for the rest of his life. His involvement in Buddhism was what took him. Sorry. His involvement in Buddhism was what took him to Burma in 1950. He was ostensibly there as a consultant to the UN, as an economist, to evaluate their program for economic and social development. He was also there to study Buddhism and to work with this fellow on the right-hand side, Yuba Kin, who was a Buddhist teacher. He was also a public servant. So this was a watershed for Schumacher, going to Burma. He was very critical of the influence of American economists and engineers on Burmese economic development. And he gave voice to these criticisms in his official report in a fairly moderate way, in his official report. But privately, he wrote this paper, Economics in a Buddhist Country, which later became Buddhist Economics. And this was a key paper by Schumacher. So it was in Burma that, if you like, you had his economics being confronted with his new private beliefs. He was very concerned with what intensive economic development would do to Burmese Buddhist culture. And the paper, Buddhist Economics, grew out of that concern. It was a concern for cultural preservation. You've all read Buddhist Economics. He says there's more than one kind of economics, depends on the society one is dealing with. He said one should be very wary about the influence of foreign economic advisors, especially in economic and social matters. He said there were essentially three conditions for any society: misery, which was what you had in India; sufficiency, which is what you had in places like Burma, notwithstanding the impact of World War II. In Burma, he found a society where people had enough, and also where people seemed to be significantly happier than people in the West. And of course, there was excess, which was epitomized by, for example, New York. When he went through New York on his way to Burma, he said, this is an awful society. By now, Gandhi, he was describing as the greatest man of our age. And he speaks about Gandhi's campaign, satyagraha of non-violent, peaceful change. Swadeshi and Kadar, the the promotion of local development, dealing with local merchants, giving priority to dealing with one's neighbors in the economic sphere, and also being involved in manual labor and, if possible, creating one's spinning and weaving. Gandhi placed great emphasis on these, as you know. He drew attention to the distinction between renewable and non-renewable resources, which the Indians were already writing about. And Schumacher, in this paper, said that oil, coal, and steel were necessarily temporary. So this is the Schumacher who was working with the coal board back in London. As for nuclear energy, Heisenberg notwithstanding, he regarded as something that was forbidden. This is a very strong paper. And as you know, it would become the flagship chapter, the keystone chapter in his book. After Burma, he continued these explorations. He became what could be called a soft traditionalist. The traditionalist writings of people such as René Guénon, Fritjof Schuon, and Ananda Coomaraswamy became very important for him. He was deeply read in the three of these, Schuon in particular. They wrote about the Sophia Perennis, perennial wisdom, the idea that going back through the mists of time, there is this perennial wisdom, perennial philosophy concerning man's relationship with the divine. They placed Schuon in particular spoke about the transcendental unity of religions, namely that all the great religions, there are these external differences, but fundamentally they're all concerned with the same thing. So the same fundamental esoteric similarity between them concerning man and the divine. The traditionalists prized traditional cultures. They prized cultures in which religion was important, in which man's relationship with the divine was central. They regarded modern materialism as a deviation in the history of humanity, as a deviation, beginning with, Descartes, amplified by the scientific and industrial revolution. This period of history they regarded as a deviation. And with that came a critique of technology, critical of the machine, critical of automated manufacture, great appreciation of craft, not least because of these connections between craft and religious belief. Schumacher became, as I said, deeply steeped in his reading of the traditionalists. By 1959, he himself was teaching a course on the perennial philosophy at the University of London, a continuing education course. And here we see this double life. Here he speaks about his double life. On the one hand, he's involved with this very modern world of science and technology and industrial conflict at the Coal Board. Privately, he's reading Gandhi, the Indians, and these traditionalists. And he now speaks about Homo economicus as being an insidious poison which is destroying the traditional consciousness of man. And this phrase here, the traditional consciousness of man, I think is absolutely key to understanding Schumacher. That's key. By the late 50s, he was now in demand at the Coal Board, because the coal industry was beginning to be, well, it had always been, since the war, an industry in decline, but now it was an industry that was under significant threat from imported oil. And Schumacher became involved in rationalization at the Coal Board. He became an important figure defending coal in the public sphere. He became the right-hand man to Robins, who was the new head of the Coal Board as of the chairman as of 1957. Schumacher became an important figure. At this time, the coal industry was undergoing significant change. Going way back, coal, the taking of coal from the mines involved merely manual tools, extremely difficult. Then, of course, you had things like drills and dynamite being used. But nonetheless, the taking of coal was very much a manual, a manual activity. This we see in the top two photographs. During the late 1950s and the 1960s, coal became increasingly mechanized with the implantation of machines like the Samson stripper, which you see an example of this kind of machinery in the lower photograph, scraping the coal away from the coal face, and the miners became shovelers and loaders of coal that was stripped by the machine. So it was this huge transformation of mining labor during this time. Schumacher was deeply involved in this. So he was very much involved in this transformation of the coal industry, in its rationalization, in the implantation of heavy technology. Privately, however, he maintained his involvement. Well, just before we leave that, this, of course, is Aberfan in 1966, the disaster in Wales. Schumacher was there at the Coal Board through all of this. This was a difficult time for the Coal Board. It was. Nonetheless, the Coal Board, he had great flexibility at the Coal Board. Robins gave him time to take leave of absence to travel to India, where Schumacher maintained his involvements in the developing world. Privately, he became involved in the promotion of intermediate technology. He was influenced obviously by Gandhi, who favored craft and manual labor, was very critical of factory automation. He was also influenced by the traditionalists with their ideas on craft. He became very critical of the World Bank, who at the time were promoting these sophisticated, expensive, high capital developments, whether it be dams or sophisticated factories. Schumacher became a great critic of Eugene Black, the director of the World Bank. And he said that this use of expensive capital was putting projects out of reach of ordinary people and was bringing in science and technology which was beyond their ken. He had a great conflict at Cambridge in 1963 with Caldor. This is Caldor down here on the left-hand side, Nicholas Caldor, on this question of the use of technology. Caldor was sort of a conventional economist, said we should be using the most sophisticated technology available. This was the most economically the most efficient. Schumacher's response was that these huge projects were their effect was to develop the metropole, cause rural urban migration, undermine local communities and local craft. And so there was this great confrontation at Cambridge in 1963, where Schumacher, against virtually everybody present, was promoting the use of intermediate technology. Undeterred, he formed the Intermediate Technology Development Group, which began the promotion of the use of relatively simple tools that were better than what people had, in India and elsewhere, but were much less sophisticated than what the World Bank were offering. This is their first catalogue in 67, 68. By the mid-60s, he was keen to get out of the Cold War, but he couldn't because he was so valuable to them. And they needed, increasingly needed people to defend coal, which he did, and he hung on until 1970. Nonetheless, during this time, he felt, as I said, he was keen to get out. He was much more interested in intermediate technology in the developing world. He was writing in places such as Resurgence magazine, with which many of you are familiar, which after was soon run by Satish Kumar. So Schumacher became involved in Resurgence magazine, very much involved, writing about decentralization, became close to the Welsh independence movement, wrote favorably about Mao's China. So he was on the one hand involved with the Cold War, on the other hand writing in marginal places like Resurgence. Then he left the Cold War in 70. I should also say that his religious beliefs evolved. After Burma, he moved away from Buddhism and moved closer to Christianity. When his wife, Anna Maria, passed away in 1960, he essentially embraced Christianity. When he left the Cold War in 1970, he converted to Catholicism, following Barbara Wood, his daughter. So all of this was going on, in, if you like, in the background. Writing in Resurgence, leaves the Cold War in 1970, and then pulls various chapters and papers together, with difficulty finds a publisher, and publishes his book, Small is Beautiful, 1973. I think he had no expectation that would be popular. So here, you know, as you all know, it's about peace and permanence. Very much inspired by the Gandhians, this notion of peace and permanence. Buddhist economics, key chapter, right? Decentralization, non-violence, the proper use of land, technology with the human face. And he presents all of this as ideas that are relevant to the East, the developing East, but also to the West. You know, it's a book that was both concerned with offering a certain path for development to India and other countries, but also it's a book that fed into the critique of life in modern industrial society. The psychological element was important. In that regard, it was sort of close to Eric Fromm, you know, the Fromm's critique of North American life in his books in the 70s. The book was surprisingly very well received, especially in North America. And he all of a sudden he was plunged into the limelight, into the public sphere, with invitations to North America to give talks, invitations to university campuses, to Zen Buddhist retreats, invitations from Jerry Brown, the governor of California, a visit to the White House, to Carter's White House. He all of a sudden he was being solicited left, right, and center. And this went on, you know, between the publication of the book for the next, until he died in 1977. And he died, as you all probably know, of a heart attack on a train in Switzerland on his way to yet another public engagement. Now, upon his death in 77, I think just shortly before his untimely death in 77, he was able to publish his next book, A Guide for the Perplexed. This is, if you like, barely disguised spiritual autobiography. This is, if you read, this can be read as a description of his own path. He speaks about, just, talks about the failure of the modern experiment. There are even veiled allusions to Keynes in this book. He says that the human survival, is impossible without religion. Here he says it explicitly. He didn't say it explicitly in Small is Beautiful, but here he says it explicitly. Unlike Small is Beautiful, which had great success, A Guide for the Perplexed was a flop. Many of the people who read Small is Beautiful had difficulty reading this book. Many couldn't quite reconcile the activist Schumacher that they saw in Small is Beautiful with the, if you like, the religious Schumacher that was evident in A Guide for the Perplexed. So this book was not not at all successful or well met. If I had to sum up and talk about his legacy, obviously there are groups such as your own, organizations like Practical Action, New Economics Foundation, Schumacher Institute, the Schumacher Center in Massachusetts, which are concerned with, well, are concerned with practical action, local initiatives, the piecemeal transformation of community life through various programs, whether it's abroad with practical action, or in England or other countries with the New Economics Foundation, with the Schumacher Institute. So there's this strong practical element of practical reform, practical programs, and there's no question that this was emphasized by Schumacher in his talks. He said that I'm a shoemaker. I begin with leather at the last, and one begins where one is, and one begins with what one has. So there's no question about it that Schumacher emphasized practical initiative, practical measures, especially at the community level. In the field of ecological economics, he is seen as a sort of a forefather, founder, by people like Herman Daly. I spoke to Herman Daly before he passed away. But as some of you probably know, the field of ecological economics has evolved, and what we've seen, for example, is a lot of emphasis on ecosystem services, on the monetary evaluation of ecosystem services, and this being used as an argument by ecological economics for the preservation of nature. An economic monetary argument for the preservation of nature. I think Schumacher would not have appreciated this kind of work at all. I don't think he would have appreciated this. But with the general thrust of ecological economics, very much so. And then there are what I've described as the moral critics. And these are people that I see as also very much heirs to Schumacher's intellectual legacy. I mentioned three of them. One is Syed Hossein Nasr, who was trained as a historian of science at Harvard. He's of Iranian origin, trained as a historian of science at Harvard, moved away from the history of science to embrace traditionalism, was close to Schuon, and since the late 60s has written very extensively in the field of traditionalism. Schumacher read Nasr read Schumacher, and in books such as this early book by Nasr, The Encounter of Man and Nature, The Spiritual Crisis of Modern Man, this is very much Schumacherian in its outlook. Another figure is Wendell Berry, the American writer, who left New York to return to his native Kentucky, wrote a book, many books, one of which was The Unsettling of America, which was all about the effect of industrial agriculture on the landscape and on rural communities. Wendell Berry was influenced by the rural reconstruction writers in England that led to the formation of the Soil Association. Northbourne, Gardner, Massingham. Wendell Berry is also a religious man. And the third person is Philip Sherard, of whom many of you will have heard, an Englishman, who became a member of the Greek Orthodox Church and went to live on an island in Greece, where he built a small church. And if you read his book, The Rape of Man and Nature, which is a sort of an uncompromising book in a similar spirit, he too I would regard as somebody who's writing perhaps much more uncompromisingly in a way that's coherent with Schumacher. So I shall stop there and take any questions if you have them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert. That was absolutely amazing. I thought I knew a lot about Schumacher. I lots of little pieces of the story all along the way, but you've very well made a complete story out of it, which makes it a wonderful presentation. And you've made it connected all the pieces, which I think is fascinating. Um, I'm very happy to host now questions from anybody who has them. If you could maybe use the raised hand signal to indicate that you have something to ask or to just to say, really, some comment on that. Um, Robert, I'll leave you to field the questions, and we'll start with Alison. Thank you.
Hi there. Thank you very much. I feel exactly the same as Ian just said. I thought I knew a bit about Schumacher, but gosh, that was fantastic. I want to pick up on the poor reception of the second book, the religious kind of autobiography, as you describe it, and I wonder whether you feel that it didn't go down very well because at the time perhaps there was a sense that religion was kind of necessarily and automatically conservative in the true sense as opposed to activist, and whether Schumacher was actually partly because he'd come at things from a very sort of Eastern religious perspective a lot in his life, very much rooted in an idea of religion that absolutely was about
I've frozen up again.
show great interest in his ideas in Small is Beautiful, but when it came to his Catholicism, that would be a sort of a matter of embarrassment. This is something that, this is something that, yes, a matter of embarrassment. This is the way he puts it. You also see it in some of the writing. I wrote a paper for the 10 Minutes Academy Review the year before last, 23, where I talk about the reception of this book. And many of the activists, as you intimate in your question, many of the environmental activists at the time were open to Buddhism and Eastern religion, but were not at all open to the Christianity of the West. And this may well be because, well, that's a long and complicated history. But there was certainly this resistance to the institutions, the Christian institutions, the church, perhaps because they were seen as conservative. The activist Christ that you allude to or you mention is more in the tradition of Christian anarchism, which was not very present in these discussions. So there was this resistance and disinterest with regard to a Guide for the Perplexed. And another consideration is that the environmental movement was becoming increasingly secular. It was becoming a movement that was detached from any kind of religious or spiritual considerations. And it would evolve along those lines and become what it is now, sort of campaigns conducted on social media. There was this secular, when Schumacher was writing, there was the secularization of the environmental movement had begun. And so there was this disconnect between that movement and his second book. They're the sorts of things that come to mind.
Thank you. Yeah. It's very interesting, isn't it? Because another trajectory ends in spiritual ecology, and then suddenly his work has its own place on that pathway that makes complete sense. So it's
you mean people like Thomas Berry?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, you have to be careful here because Thomas Berry grew out of the work of Teilhard de Chardin. And the traditionalists were not at all receptive to Teilhard de Chardin because of this marriage that Teilhard de Chardin brought about between very advanced science, including nuclear science, and religion.
Okay.
So that's a consideration to be borne in mind. If you read people like Thomas Berry and the people at Yale who are carrying on Thomas Berry's work, this grows out of Teilhard de Chardin, and Schumacher was not at all sympathetic to Teilhard de Chardin. So that's a consideration. That's a consideration to be borne in mind. But maybe you have other examples of spiritual ecology in mind. I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
John, you have your hand up there. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, and Professor Leonard, for a very interesting presentation. I people call me a conservative, but I call myself a libertarian. Not that that has any bearing on what I'm going to ask about, but I just think it's an interesting sort of thinking about the labels that you used. I see that you've written quite a lot about sort of intermediate technology. What would the intermediate technology look like if Schumacher was alive today? How would he see it? Given that now you can run a global corporation from your back bedroom, and technology has changed or will change so much, so considerably, to the extent it's conceivable that we could see economic growth occurring without additional resource use, or even resource use going in the opposite direction. Um, how is the intermediate technology relativist? I mean, he was writing his time at the coal board. The coal industry employs 600,000 people in this country. Um, Not so many years later, the coal production in this country was roughly the same as it was in the 1950s, but with a fraction of the number of people. I mean, those huge changes. Um, I mean, what is the? I guess I'm saying, what is the future relevance of Schumacher if Schumacherian thought can't embrace that relativist change in circumstances?
Yeah, that's another good question.
Hmm.
Okay, two things come to mind. One is, for example, the work of practical action, which, unless I'm mistaken, involves the promotion of the use of cell phones, this kind of technology, in communities, in poor communities. Using cell phones for all the things that cell phones offer, the iPhone. So they, I believe, actively promote this kind of technology in societies where it's very new. And there's no question that, as you say, using so-called smart technology allows you to do things at a distance, in some sense using less resources, but of course there are also the resources involved in mining and data centers and all of this. So there's that dimension to the use of smart technology. On the other hand, here I think of the work of Paul Kingsnorth, who has just brought out a book called Against the Machine. Paul Kingsnorth is an Englishman, writer, very involved in the past in ecological activism. He's now living in County Galway. Has brought out a book on Against the Machine, which is a thoroughgoing critique of the use of our embrace of IT from a humanist perspective, namely on the way it corrodes our social relations, isolates us one from the other, affects our children's brains. So there is this strong critique of information technology and the smartphone. And I can't help thinking that Schumacher would have been very sympathetic to this critique. I believe that he would have been sympathetic. Paul Kingsnorth, there's a lot in Paul Kingsnorth that resembles Schumacher. There is. So that's the way I respond to your question. I think there's a lot in surrounding the contemporary problems and ills of information IT, of which Schumacher would have been very critical. I do. So that's the way I see that. That's not a satisfactory simple answer to your question, but that's the way I see it.
And thank you, Robert. Yeah. Chris, what's your thoughts on that one?
Just to follow up on that, I first of all add my thanks to the others have given for a very interesting talk. Thank you very much, Robert. I just wanted raise something. I was going through my emails just before this started, and by coincidence, perhaps, I had a paper sent to me from the Journal of Global Trade Ethics and Law, published earlier this year, Degrowth or Growth, a life or death question for humanity. And I've only really read the abstract, but right in the middle of the abstract, it says degrowth would most likely entail adopting Buddhist economics suggested by E.F. Schumacher, the author of Small is Beautiful. I wonder whether you get a sense that his ideas are now being picked up again by movements such as the degrowth movement.
Yeah, another good question. Okay, the first thing is that the Buddhist economics idea there's a literature now on Buddhist economics which involves Buddhist economics being propagated amongst large companies, Buddhist economics. There's a recent book called Buddhist Economics, which says that Buddhist economics is perfectly consonant with personal enrichment and the pursuit of wealth. So there's strange things going on with Buddhist economics at the moment. On this question of growth and degrowth, that's another complicated one. Schumacher himself on the question of growth actually writes that he's not against growth. He's not against economic growth. He's against certain kinds of economic growth. All societies have to develop, and their economic growth is part of the natural progress, if you like. But he said that there are certain kinds of growth that are desirable, other kinds of growth that are not. And in his work for the Intermediate Technology Development Group, giving advice to African countries, he talks about how to develop the society using certain kinds of technology, certain kinds of organizations. So there is economic growth, but it's not deleterious and undesirable economic growth. So that's his position on this growth question. It's not a question of stopping growth, of simply going into permanent recession, to put it that way. It's a sort of a critical view of growth.
Thank you.
We could talk at length about the degrowth literature. That take us into another area, but that's the way I see Schumacher on this question.
Thank you, Chris, for that as well. It's a huge area of interest and discussion for us at the moment. This whole degrowth agenda, and it's going to run for quite a while. A lot to explore there, indeed.
Yeah, I think it's a bad term, degrowth.
I don't like it much either. Yeah,
I think they made a mistake with that term.
It is sticking though, but there we go. Nat, over to you. Yeah.
Hi, Robert. It was a pleasure to hear you, and we've swapped a few emails. This is the first time we've spoken.
Yes.
I had to miss a few crucial moments of your talk because I'm looking after my kids and had someone at the door and stuff. But I think a couple of thoughts. It was really interesting. The conservative radicalism is really interesting, and it made me think of a description I believe that George Orwell once gave of himself as a Tory anarchist. And I wonder whether it's sort of, this similar mix of conservatism, but also quite radical. And I don't know, and maybe this was one of the bits when I stepped out, but I heard you mention David Astor, but I didn't hear a lot about Schumacher's role. And as I said, this might be when I stepped out on The Observer, as I understood. He was like a leader writer in the 40s and 50s. And I know Orwell worked there at the same time. And I just wonder whether they did have any connection related to that. I'm afraid I've got a few little questions. That's just one of them. Interesting to hear you talk about the environmental movement becoming increasingly secularized. And I do see that. Like if you look at Oxfam, if you look at Greenpeace, there's a lot of Quakers, there's a lot of other religious groups getting involved. But actually, if you read someone, I've got quite into this professor at Florida called Bron Taylor, and he wrote a really interesting book a couple of years ago called Dark Green Religion, where he argues that if you look at, say, surfing communities, or if you look at certain environmental groups, there is a sort of natural religion that he believes, 500 years into the future, might become, a real challenge to the large monotheistic religions. And if you look at, say, in the UK with the water crisis, it's group like Surfers Against Sewage and those people with kind of direct connection with nature that have been some of the most influential. And so, yeah, I mean, this is very different to Schumacher's type of Catholicism, but at the same time, you do have the greening of the major religions. So I wonder if things are not too dissimilar. And then, yeah, I wondered also about other people who were influenced by Schumacher. I once listened to and came across a guy called John Fullerton, who runs the Capital Institute, which is, he's quite critical, promotes circular economy, and it's, fairly high profile, former banker at JP Morgan that's been doing this stuff for 25 years. And he said reading Small is Beautiful was an amazing light bulb moment for him. And then also people like Hazel Henderson, obviously of an older generation. So that was that. And then just one thought about the growth aspect. What I had ringing in my mind from Schumacher would be that he would be telling us that it was all about the difference between quality and quantity, and that it's crazy to kind of just look at growth or just look at the economy through a quantity lens. Effectively, I love this line of his, metaphysical blindness, effectively that you can't actually see so much of what's going on. And so quantitative growth is kind of here or there. It could or not. What you actually need to do is see quality, and you want growth in quality. But I don't know. Sorry, there's lots of things there. But thank you for all that.
Thanks very much, Nat. Yeah, there's a lot there. I can't answer all of this satisfactorily. On Orwell, Orwell was involved with the Observer. Schumacher was involved with the Observer. Orwell was a guest on Jura, at the Astor's home in Jura, in the Scottish Isles. So was Schumacher, but I've seen no direct connection between Orwell and Schumacher. He had read Orwell, so I think he was great respect for Orwell. I think there was. I don't think there was any great appreciation in Schumacher for the Tories in general. He was surrounded by Tory neighbours in Surrey, but I think there was a sense of distance between this Fabian socialist, or erstwhile Fabian socialist, and his Tory neighbours. I could talk at length about his relationship with Astor. I'm not going to do it here. But yes, Astor was very important. Astor helped shape his literary style. He became a very good writer, thanks to David Astor. Bron Taylor, I'm familiar a little bit with his work, familiar with the journal he writes about. I wasn't at all familiar with his writing about surfers, and there is obviously, there's again, this is huge. There's a whole question of pantheism, panentheism, the place of nature in the environmental movement. All I would say is that for Schumacher was not a romantic lover of nature. He did not take his family out on hikes at the weekend. He didn't spend huge amounts of time out in nature. So he approached this from an intellectual perspective. His quotations on nature are from St. Augustine, people like that, or Aquinas. It's very much it's an intellectual relationship he had. He was not a romantic like the English romantics or like other environmental activists. It was an intellectual relationship he had, sort of an austere intellectual relationship. John Fullerton, I'd have to look him up. I'm not familiar with what he's done. The distinction between quantity and quality is key here. Guénon's the second key book that René Guénon wrote was The Reign of Quantity and the Signs of the Times. And this was a traditionalist critique of modernity with its emphasis on quantity and the loss of sight of quality. Schumacher read this book and was very much affected by it. So part of his critique of the reign of quantity, and he would often use the terms the reign of quantity in inverted commas without mentioning Guénon's name, because he was a sort of a closet or soft traditionalist. He would allude to it, but his critique of modern development and the place of economists therein, and the blind reliance on measure and quantity and GDP and these kinds of statistics, was rooted in his reading of the traditionalists, including Guénon. And we can see his comments on growth in the light of that.
That's all fascinating. Thank you.
Thanks, Nat.
Thank you there, Robert and Nat. And just noticing a question turned up in the chat here from Angela. And Angela, do you want to ask it directly, or shall I read it? No, she's right. Angela's asking here. Industrialization goes hand in hand with the increasing use of fossil fuel, then resulting in climate change. Is the climate crisis a motivation jumping point to explore and expand the use of Schumacher's idea of intermediate technology? It is an interesting point that when Schumacher was writing "Small is Beautiful," there was very little mention of climate change in the world dialogue. So yes, it's where do you see that fitting in now into an exploration of his ideas? Yeah.
Yes. These are all good questions. One of the key influences on Schumacher, to whom we didn't give due credit, was Richard Gregg. Richard Gregg was an American lawyer who became a Gandhian. He left an industrial relation there who left America to Gandhi. And he became a representative, sort of a Western representative ambassador for Gandhian ideas. He wrote several books read by Schumacher, one of which was the idea of voluntary simplicity. Voluntary simplicity. Initially, so this idea of voluntary simplicity, to which Schumacher was very much attached, grew out of this Gandhian literature. The whole question of climate change, as I see it, is simply a continuation of what was already manifesting itself, what has been manifesting itself since the Industrial Revolution, namely our incursion upon the natural environment, our destruction of the natural environment. So the climate change is it's the latest bad news in that regard. And I think Schumacher's response, part of it would involve the necessity to greatly simplify our lives, to avoid traveling so much by airplane, to take a critical view when it comes to technology, and to take all those measures that we can to greatly simplify our environmental impact, at the same time as promoting local community development. This is not easy given where we all are and the sort of the networks that we're locked into and tied into. But that's the way I would imagine his response. It is.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you. And nobody else got any questions. Just one little point that came from your presentation was one of the concepts of Schumacher there was peace and permanence. And I just wonder whether you could expand a little bit on what you meant by permanence in that framing.
This comes perhaps not uniquely, but a significant source of this was the work of Kumarappa, who was Gandhi's economist, trained in New York, went back to India, became involved in the independence movement. And he was a Gandhian economist who wrote about peace and permanence. What they intended by permanence was what today we call sustainability, in the sense of the development of society and the economy in such a way that it can be sustained, that it can be permanent, that's the simple idea. And the distinction between renewable and non-renewable resources, and the need to use renewable resources, came from this literature surrounding Gandhi. Kumarappa writes about this. Right. And this distinction that you see by Schumacher in Buddhist economics comes from that literature. It does. So that's what was meant by peace and permanence. And of course, the idea of peace is, well, if there are non-renewable resources and various nations are competing for access to non-renewable resources such as oil, then inevitably they're led into conflict.
Yeah. So
a lot of discussion of the links between intensive economic activity and violence. That's
great. Thank you indeed, Robert. We in the Institute here have a continual cycle of rethinking what we're trying to do. And I think a phrase came up today from John about the future relevance of Schumacher. And I think that's something we are always sort of thinking about, is how does it fit into what we want to do all the time? And I'd just like to say a big thank you for helping us with that process of thinking today, because you've opened up quite a fair number of channels of thought for what relevance it has for us, and I think it points to a much stronger connection to Schumacher's work is what we need to build on and develop within ourselves in the next few years as we progress. Yeah. So on behalf of everybody here, I'd like to say very, very big thank you very much for what you've presented today. And we hope we continue to make a long-lasting association with yourself, and that'd be brilliant. Lots of thanks coming up with hands everywhere. So, Robert, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ian, and thanks to all of you very much indeed. Thank you.
Cheers, everybody. See you all again soon. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thanks, everyone.
And thanks, Ian.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Yeah. Thanks, Robert.
That
That
was
was
all, Ian. Thanks very much.
absolutely perfect. So I shall look forward to, as I say, talking with you again in the future. And if you're ever passing by Bristol Way, you know, do call in
I will.
and good safe travels with
I
everything.
will.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, Ian.
Thanks
again.
so much. Bye bye.
Bye-bye now. Bye-bye.